My name is Mathula Thangarajh. I'm a child neurologist and neuromuscular physician, but I'm also an oddball because much as I love the muscle, I like to think that I love the brain more. So my area of research interest is actually brain development and brain function in muscular dystrophy. I trained at WashU and then came to join Eric Hoffman at DC, and I'm on this migration path, so I'm moving to Richmond. But I really want to thank Deb for inviting me and to be part of this because it's not very often that I get to do some advocacy work, which is very I'm passionate about and close to my heart. But the things that I want to say is, and I told this to Jake's family, I think it really takes a lot of courage to stand in front of people and talk about your struggles and to really cry in front of strangers. I think that gives meaning to the kind of work that I do, and to resonate what Paul said is sometimes some hardship really brings you close, and to hear this from the families, it really gives new meaning to what I do every day. So I want to thank you for letting me be part of this. The other thing that I really want to share is maybe the people who have older children can resonate. So when I finished my training 5 years ago, we never saw boys like Jake and Hawken come and advocate for themselves. I think it's really changed the face of Duchenne, and to me it's so heartening to see how the things that we learned as a community has really changed this. And I really like the title of Jake's talk, which said, the future is you. So the future is you, and that's why I think it's very important to understand that the brain is an organ that's affected in Duchenne, and then learning to tend to your brain health is very important right from infancy. So so I'll begin by telling some patient stories. So these are all families that I've taken care of. This is a young boy. It's a single mom. He had some falls in school, but he had the severe developmental delay. So his primary care actually sent him off on this path. Oh, this child has a developmental delay. And they really got the rigmarole. I mean, they went to PT. They even saw a hepatologist because his enzymes were high. What happened was, his mom, when we made the diagnosis when he was 6, his mom was not so much worried about his muscle health because, as somebody said, school became a battle. She didn't know because he was fixated. He could spend hours like playing on a truck. School couldn't cope, she couldn't cope, and you hear this is a theme that resonates with so many young families when you say, oh, my child cannot speak in full sentences. He's now sometimes 5, 6, 7. They go to school, they tend to have a lot of anxiety, they can have features that are suggestive of autism spectrum, ADHD. So this makes it challenging, not just from taking care of your son physically, but also caring for their brain health. And school doesn't always have resources, and they turn to the medical team, and we don't have resources, right? You're like, okay, good, you have ADHD, please see your primary care. Obviously, that doesn't help you. The other challenge is ADHD symptoms can happen very young. They can be 4, 5. Repetitive behavior can happen, so they can have some OCD. But the science doesn't allow you to make a diagnosis until they are 6, 7, meaning it has to show disruption in school. It has to be disruptive at play. So then you're talking about you're already vulnerable, and then you're talking about being more vulnerable. So how do you kind of like catch up? So this is another family that I've been taking care of. He's a 2-year-old child, and again, the same vein as the other one is child who has very severe anxiety and autism spectrum. But we know from other neurodevelopmental disorders, that the earlier you diagnose conditions like autism spectrum, the earlier you can intervene, you really change the trajectory. And I strongly believe that it could be true for Duchenne as well. There was a recent paper from MD StarNet. This is the MD StarNet is 5 sites, which is funded from the CDC, where they look at the population-based data. So, which means this is the real life setting. So they looked at young boys who had, who are the people who use resources at school. So they found that if your child had used speech therapists, that means that they used more resources at school. So that means that they wanted an aid. What does that tell you? That tells that these problems tend to travel together. So they are like cousins, as we can think about. If you can think about, so a child who has speech delay might have other delays. They can have learning difficulties. It's difficult to engage with the teacher. It's difficult to engage with another child. And as you know, small children, social contact and play is a very important way in which they learn. So this means that a child who cannot express himself can have difficulty in learning to communicate and to learn as well. So these could be small things, but how does it impact the development? I think that's a bigger scientific question that we are still struggling to answer. But I think there's already evidence that the more resources that you use, then the more challenges there are. The same study also showed that children who have speech delay tend to repeat a grade. And this happens very early, so they actually tend to repeat school at kindergarten. So it's not all gloom and doom. We definitely know that there are very good examples. There are people surviving into adulthood. So there's data from Japan and France which have said that now the age expectancy is upper 40s for Duchenne. We know certainly in the spectrum they are independent, they can go on to live fulfilling lives. But the question is, when do you begin? How much is good for brain health? Can anybody guess who this is? I'll buy you coffee.
It's his name Duchenne.
Yes. So Duchenne de Boulogne was a very famous French neurologist. So, so the French claim they discovered Duchenne and the English claim they ate Duchenne, but who wants to do the Anglo-French fight? Not me. Duchenne actually in his first ever description of the muscular dystrophy cohort, so he studied 12 boys who came with progressive muscle weakness. If you look at the 1852 publication, the 12 boys who he described, all of them had speech delay, developmental delay. So even in that original cohort, he called out that the brain is involved. So somebody this morning asked me, is brain a muscle? No, brain is not a muscle. But I think the critical question they wanted to know is, why is it that the lack of dystrophin in the brain really causes a problem? And we'll come to that later. But to go back to Duchenne, so despite the fact that 150 years ago he described that there is speech delay, developmental delay, in the clinic this doesn't get as much consideration as it should. So the way we think about brain function and development is a spectrum. So by the 3rd month after a baby is formed in utero, the brain cells kind of like go wherever they need to go. So the neurons, as you know, cannot divide once they are fully formed. So even from the time of birth, there's a lot of remodeling going on, and we tend to think of something as, oh, well, in the first 5 years, 10 years, your brain is formed and then doesn't develop. That's not true. More and more we know that even during adulthood, there's a lot of remodeling going on. So the front part of your brain, the frontal lobes, there's a lot of white matter, so the glue-like cells which protect the neurons and function with the neurons, they constantly change. And what is very interesting is as you grow older, it's not the neurons. So if you look at Alzheimer's disease or things like that, where they think that it's the neurons that causes the degeneration. Now there's a shift away from just looking at the neurons and looking at glia as well. So when we see families and children with Duchenne, we see a spectrum. So it's not like there is one little thing that would put them and say, okay, this is what you have. So some families can struggle more with behavioral issues, some can have just developmental delay, learning difficulties, some can just have obsessive compulsive and anxiety. As Jake said, when they were young, it was the anxiety that really was a challenge to the families. And then there is some data which shows that these boys can have social anxiety. What does that mean? It means that they cannot take the initiative. So Deb said, oh, how did I encourage Hawkins to go make his appointment? It's like, well, kind of start a foundation and do that work and your son will pick it up. It doesn't always happen. So these boys do have social anxiety. It means that making interactions, reading facial cues when you are having a conversation can be challenging to some. What does this mean? It means that their quality of life can be affected because they cannot behave very well and be part of peer groups. And as you know, teenagers, it's all about belonging to peers. It's all about recognizing who you are and wanting to belong to a community. So I put up the slide of this MRI just to highlight what do we think of neuronal development right now. So like I said, the neurons are critical. Dystrophin in the neuron is very important for communication. So think of two neurons which have dystrophins as two cell phones which have a fully charged battery. So what happens when you don't have dystrophin? It's very easy to kind of picture this in your mind when dystrophin is not present in the muscle. So the way I try to explain to my families is dystrophin is like an anchor. If you can imagine a boat which has an anchor, so the sea is the muscle, so the boat is the muscle cell, and the anchor is dystrophin. So what happens when there is no anchor? So you let the boat go out and there's high tide or whatever, it'll collapse, it'll sink. It's the same with the muscle cell. So when there is no anchor, the muscle is very fragile, the membrane is fragile, and it can get broken down. Within the neuron, the neurons have to talk to each other. So in order to get that feedback, this dystrophin is extremely important. So when one neuron wants to talk to the other, the dystrophin kind of helps make that communication. So you can imagine how this is important because neurons are developing right from the time the embryo is developing and becoming into like a 1-year-old, 2-year-old. And we don't think of this as a static, but it's a very dynamic process. So it gets influenced by the environment, diet, the activity, and it's the same with the cells that surround the neurons. We call them glia, and there are multiple subtypes of the glia. There is one glia subtype which is taking a lot more attention right now because they recently discovered that it was dystrophin was expressed. In this glia, it's called oligodendrocytes, and now there's this concept, it's called activity-dependent myelination. So myelin is an insulation sheath that the oligodendrocytes produce, and you need that white substance, myelin, for these neurons to communicate very effectively. So what this means when you don't have communication is there is no fine-tuning. So it's possible that you can have developmental problems early on. They can get better. Some of it can get worse. But it's very much a very dynamic process that is mediated by these cells. So when people have looked at where is the dystrophin expressed, the dystrophin is very much expressed in the back of the brain, so it's called the hindbrain or the cerebellum, and in the front part or the frontal lobe. So there are people now trying to put together where is the gene expressed, how is the brain development, and what are these networks. So when I think of networks, it's like flying from one city to the other. So when the networks or these cables are not well connected, then you can have lots of problems. So it's the same way when dystrophin right from the cerebellum and the frontal lobe is not expressed right from childhood, then you can have these circuits which are affected. And there are some core functions like working memory, how you solve a problem. All of this is dependent on these networks right from the back of your brain to the front. So that's as much science that I will talk today. Why does this excite me? I think we as a community, I think we have done fantastically when it comes to looking at muscle health, cardiac health, looking at anticipatory guidance, what are the things you should do, how to look after your lung health. But I think we have really not done a good job when it came to developmental and brain health. So when we looked at what are the parents telling physicians and teams. So we did a study in which we used the natural history data, and we looked at about 200 boys, just young boys from 4 to 7, and we asked the parents, what are you most concerned about? And uniformly about 70 to 80% of parents said, my child has developmental delay, my child has speech and learning problems, my child has learning difficulties. Then we said, okay, let's look at the guidelines on the 2010 and the 2018 Duchenne care guidelines. When we looked at it, we were shocked because the guidelines said, please address cognitive and psychosocial health right from the time of diagnosis and periodically. And what we found from our study was that 85% of these children have never seen a mental health professional. That means all of the burden is shifted to parents. You're already struggling. You're already like, school is a battle and I have to get more resources. So where would I do that? So the other bigger impact as a community is some of these children cannot participate in clinical trials, right? And that's unfair because when it comes to the real world, you want to know how your medicine also works on restoring brain health. So a lot of people are now asking, what are the strategies we can take to kind of encourage brain health more as a team effort when it comes to evaluating these children and pointing them to the right resources. So I've gotten very interested in using, can we use technology? Can we use in a low resource setting so that no child, no matter where you are, should say, okay, I cannot have, I do not have access to go to see a neuropsychologist. So we are trying to come up with some technological platforms where the medical team can administer these tests. It can be a hub and a wheel model where you can either send it off for interpretation or you can find resources where then you'll work with a neuropsychologist. I think the other piece that I don't have much experience with, which I want to highlight, is also working with your school, but also an educational specialist. I want to say IEP is like a black box. So the interpretation of the IEP is very much dependent on your teacher. And it could be different from a DC inner city school resources to somebody in Massachusetts. And the IEP, all of the things that puts into the IEP is also dependent on the diagnosis that is put in. So if there is no ADHD, if there is no OCD, then the implementation of the IEP is extremely different. Then it becomes very challenging to say, okay, does an IEP for one child, it obviously is not the same as to the other, but is it equally effective? So there's a lot of gray zone in that. The second one is, how can we harness really brain plasticity? So there is a very big controversy in the Duchenne community as to whether they think that the brain development or the deficits in Duchenne is progressive or is it static? We don't have an answer because longitudinal study looking at brain health is not been conducted, at least I should say well-powered studies. So I think that's still a question that remains to be answered. But we are looking at some platforms which has worked in other diseases to say, can we even try to use this in boys, because we know it's very unlikely to hurt. If it's not effective, then it's better to know that as well. So with that, I will end my presentation, but I'm very happy to take questions. I already have this. To the question, has it tried in Duchenne? No, there's been some couple of studies which they have tried supplements in preterm infants. This is not something that we actively recommend, but what I would encourage families is if they think that their child is having a healthy diet and then a multivitamin or supplements, yes, but nothing specifically for brain health.
What should they be demanding in terms of testing?
Very good question. So I think the most important thing that some families are wanting to know is what should I expect? What is the trajectory that I should expect? You should have, if the team is well equipped, a neurodevelopmental assessment. If there are additional concern as to whether there is developmental delay or speech delay, then access to a speech therapist or to a developmental pediatrician, but also looking at access to a psychologist. So those are very critical. And then most of the time, most physicians will feel very comfortable working with a pediatrician to start ADHD treatment. That can happen around 6 or 7. But I think it's imperative when you go for your every 6-month visit to say, okay, can you find out if the ADHD medicine is working, or if there is, are you still noticing a lot more problems when it comes to brain health development. So it might be very challenging to do in that one sitting, in a one visit, but I think having an access to a neuropsychologist or to go see a developmental pediatrician is very important.
So when you're diagnosed, you go to see?
Absolutely. So the 2010 recommendation is that it says mental health or cognitive and psychosocial. Psychosocial more as they grow older, but definitely at the time of diagnosis and periodically. They are very vague about saying periodically because I can understand resource constraints, but yeah, you should definitely. And to continue that, I think you shouldn't feel comfortable, well, it's no longer time of diagnosis and my child is he is like in 4th grade and he's doing great. Because I was talking to one family, transition points are very challenging for these boys. So as they transition from high school to middle school to high school and then to college, because I think the way the educational system is steered is it shifts it to the child, and then it's sometimes a child who has had difficulties with attention and organizing their work in middle school and high school can really struggle in early college. So I think it's important, it's really a continuum, just like as you are saying, okay, what are the side effects of steroids? How am I looking at my skeletal muscle health? It's the same thing with the brain health, okay? What are the things I should be watching out for? If I have difficulty, I don't know, finishing my homework or whatever, what are the resources that I can tap into? And I want to echo what Jennifer said, if I don't have an answer, I'll point out to people who will have an answer. So. Sorry, you had a question.
Do you think that a neuropsych evaluation should be done as soon as possible? And so, if so, how often should it be repeated? My feeling is that it should be part of the standards of care.
So one of the constraints that we have is the number of neuropsychologists and access to them. So even in a metropolitan city like DC, the average wait time is anywhere from 6 to 9 months. And it's a little challenging when the child is 4 or 5 to have like a formal IQ testing. So I would recommend, depending on the school system that they belong to, some public schools, yes, it's part of the federal mandate to have IEP, and they'll get an IQ testing. But how often, some don't, at least most neuropsychologists will say that they don't have to repeat a formal full battery neuro testing for about 2 to 3 years especially. So if you have a good relationship with your neuropsychologist and they have said, okay, I have really identified some core domains which are affected, and I can work and really create strategies, then I would wait for a little while longer. But if it's a continual problem and you say, okay, I'm doing all of this, but I'm hitting a stone wall and I'm not seeing any progress, then I think it's worthwhile reconsidering that. But I don't want to give you specifics of like yes, you have to do it every year, because it doesn't work like that, right? I mean, the developmental trajectory can jump.
Right. But you would recommend as soon as people are diagnosed within that, as they get to the 4 or 5, to start getting on the wait list for those neuropsychologists. The same,
yes.
I mean, here in Boston, it's the same. I think everyone say 6 to 9 months.
Yeah, I would say 5 to 6 months when they are entering kindergarten to like the first grade, just to get kind of like a baseline where you are, where you're starting, because I mean, a child might also find it very challenging to cooperate on a full day of neuropsych testing, so that's something to keep in mind. But 6 is a good age to start. She had a question. Oh.
So could you touch on the subject of steroids and behavior and brain function?
So we, another big area of controversy, we certainly hear from families that behavior is a very major issue on some children with steroids. People have looked at, not in Duchenne, but other autoimmune diseases like ulcerative colitis, where they've looked at long-term steroids and said, how does brain function getting altered? So like I said, when we think of the neuron and the neuronal structures, there is some data to suggest that the way the spines are formed or the outputs of the neurons are affected by steroids. What happens in Duchenne, we don't know, but there is reason to think that it could be different, or its effect on neurons could be abnormal as well.
I was curious about, so my son was diagnosed with the OCD, ADHD, several things. Now he wasn't diagnosed on the spectrum, but he does have, it seems like he has a lot of similar like things that he does that I know my friends who their children do have autism, he does the same things, although we weren't diagnosed with that. And they told me that there was a new term called rigid thinking. And I wasn't able to look up anything about it.
So I think the alternate term is called cognitive inflexibility. That is part of the autism spectrum disorder as we understand it now. What it really means is if I'm doing a task and something else needs to be prioritized, I'm so inflexible and rigid that I will not be able to shift my attention. So more and more people are thinking about this as really a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it really has been very well characterized in the autism spectrum. So I'm not surprised, because if you look at the Duchenne population, autism is 4 times more common in Duchenne than in any other disease. So we have reasons to believe. People have done some imaging studies, but I'm sure if they do this and they characterize a lot of boys with Duchenne, they can find these abnormalities as well.
So what is the treatment for this rigid thinking? Because I couldn't really find much information on it.
So working with a behavioral therapist, because what they are going to teach you is strategies, and that's why I think it has worked very well in the autism spectrum. Behavioral or cognitive therapy really very, very early on, that you can really change outcomes. So I think working with, if you have access to like a behavioral therapist who can help guide with. So sometimes it's called ABT or
ABD?
ABT, Adaptive Behavioral Therapy.
Okay. Okay, ABA. And I just want to thank you so much, because being part of community groups, online and stuff, I see so many families who are struggling and just thinking that their kid is bad or tired because their muscles hurt and they're acting out. But I really feel like it's not that. And they kind of treat their kids, as if they're just being bad. And I feel like the word has to get out more to these families to really do testing and find ways to help them, so.
And if I can just jump in, I'm a speech pathologist, as some of you may have known at the beginning, but so my specialty was working with children with autism. And so there's a lot of characteristics of ADHD and autism that look a lot alike. They present alike, but it really could be the ADHD, it's the chicken or the egg. So that could be some of what you're seeing too when looking at other kids that have autism, and yours isn't diagnosed that, but it could be the ADHD that you're really seeing, but looks like autism.
And they can coexist. So 15% of boys with Duchenne will have more than one neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's just not OCD. It's not just autism, but it's autism plus ADHD. And then what that really means is that the burden of this neurodevelopmental burden becomes higher, right? So.